Well, the major principle for followers of Jesus is to validate, encourage, and help those who are marginalized or oppressed, those who maybe can't do things on their own or have a situation that's outside of their control. And those who are oppressed or marginalized, some of them, it's to no fault of their own. The deck is stacked against them in some way, and there's nothing that they can do themselves to overcome it. There are others that they may be in the position because it's self-inflicted. But just because it's self-inflicted doesn't mean that we dismiss them, dismiss their suffering and what they're going through. Because I'm reminded of a situation I'm aware of that is cyclical poverty. A family is in at least the fourth generation of poverty. And so the next generation that's coming up knows nothing besides poverty. So that's what they know. They don't know that there's a possibility beyond that. They don't know that they can dream above what their current reality is. So they are marginalized in a way that maybe they can do something about it, but they're not sure how. And so from Jesus, we come to whoever it is, whatever the situation is, and we validate that person as valuable. Now, the story of Ruth is a story that shows how we are to treat others. I mean, there are a lot of principles in the book of Ruth, but one of the things we find is that Ruth is an outsider. She is different. She is someone who didn't belong, someone who really, for all intents and purposes, could have been condemned and left to be not valuable. She was a foreigner. She was a different socioeconomic status. She was a different race. And yet we find that she was valuable and she was invited into the redemptive plan of God. And so when we think of our world today and how we relate it to who Ruth is as a person, when we see injustice, we must call it injustice. But make sure we recognize that your social media newsfeed post is not the limit of your responsibility. And if you haven't gotten to where I'm going, I'm referencing the George Floyd situation and the stress and the turmoil that is causing in our world today. And justice happens in our world, and we must not stand beside it and say, who cares? But we also must recognize that there's a deeper calling than just posting a few comments on social media. We're called to be active participants in the kingdom of God. And through the story of Ruth, we can see how God can transform lives. He can transform situations even when there seemed to be no hope. And in Ruth's situation, and in many injustices we see in the world, desperate times call for desperate measures. And these desperate measures can oftentimes put us in situations that are undesirable or compromising or less than ideal. But we have to make sure we always uphold the character of Jesus Christ. But character is not determined in the moment. Character is determined in private and displayed in the moment. If we're not working on our character with Jesus beforehand, we're not going to display it later. And so this is why I say that godly choices bring godly capital. Because we find Ruth and Naomi are both widows. Ruth is Naomi's daughter-in-law, and they really don't have much prospects. But in Ruth chapter 2, Ruth goes and gleans a field, menial, hard, sometimes demeaning work that really doesn't produce much. But this guy named Boaz was extra generous and helped Ruth and Naomi. And Naomi, I realizes that Boaz is somebody who can really help their family. He can be what's called a kinsman redeemer, or family redeemer, someone who helps them get out of this poverty situation they're in. So Naomi gives Ruth some instructions and basically says, hey, go and be with Boaz when he is asleep. So we pick up the story in Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 7. And after Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down by the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up. He turned over and was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my kinsman or family redeemer. And Boaz said, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you are not going after a younger man, whether rich or poor." So in this setting, remember, this was at the end of the barley harvest. We found that out in Ruth chapter 2. And so they would gather the grain, and they would put it in this threshing floor, and then they would take a winnowing fork and throw the grain in the air, and it would separate the grain from the chaff so they could keep the grain, and the wind would blow the chaff away. And it was hard work. It was long work. It was work that took all day, and it seemed like you didn't really make much progress. But at this point, Boaz has done all the work. He has planted the field. He's made sure the weeds aren't there. He has gathered the harvest. He has separated the wheat from the chaff. And so it's there. It's done. And the harvest, the food that he has produced is at its most vulnerable. So he wants to make sure that it's safe, which is why he sleeps by the pile of grain. Now, as I said earlier, Boaz had already extended extreme generosity towards Naomi and Ruth, had given them more than what they deserved, more than what the law required, but he acted out of love. And that may all be true. Ruth and Naomi may have been really blessed by Boaz's generosity, but they were widows. They didn't have really much claim to anything or any way to get much income. And so they may have still been thinking, well, this was great, but this might not get us to next harvest. This might not be enough to fulfill our needs. And so we have this nighttime experience. And one of the things about nighttime is it recognizes the darkness and the despair that we may be encountering. But in this moment, God is getting ready to shine his light to contrast the darkness. So she goes and she lays at his feet or beside him. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves about this story is this something that can be divinely blessed? Can God be sitting up there in heaven and be like, this was a good idea. Good work, Naomi. And so we have to look at what's actually happening. We have the concept of alcohol, of Boaz had eaten, he had drunk, and he had slept. It was a hard day. And why that's important is if you remember the history of Moab, which is where Ruth was from. Ruth was a Moabitess. Moab started from an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter because she got him drunk and he didn't know what he was doing. So in the back of the reader's mind, we know the story of Moab, and we see is Ruth reverting back to her ancestral practices. Is this just a cultural thing that Ruth is doing to manipulate the situation? But then we have the lying at the feet. And some of it we have to recognize Ruth is following the instructions that Naomi has given her. What she is doing is exactly what Naomi told her to do. So what are Naomi's intentions? We have to come to the point of, is this a seductive act or not? Whenever we look at stories like this, we recognize that it's a translation, that the original language it was written in is Hebrew, has different phrases and idioms that don't necessarily translate to a different language. And the word feet is indeed a euphemism in Hebrew. And so we say, oh, that might not look real good. But then we have the spread of the garment and kind of the implication of coming under Boaz's wing, which again is another euphemism in Hebrew. And we think about all these things. We think about what Ruth and Naomi are going through, and we can say, you know, these choices may not look real good, but we understand them. Especially if you have gone hungry and without food or don't know how to pay the next bill, you may know about desperate situations and the desperate measures we take. Now, I'm not trying to justify our actions saying it's okay, because Boaz is what makes this story work. He was asleep. He was drinking, and if we're probably honest, I'm guessing he was not the most cognizant he's ever been. He'd just woken up at midnight. He wasn't thinking necessarily clearly. So this opportunity essentially presents itself to Boaz. And we ask the question, will he take advantage of it? Now, I want to be careful not to glorify Boaz. It's not as though he was just this amazing person, and just because he was amazing, God was able to do good things. What I believe happened is that God's Spirit was able to give Boaz the understanding and wisdom and insight and poise needed to allow God's plan of redemption to come through. It was God's Spirit that enabled Boaz to be who he needed to be in that situation. But remember, it's the times in private that determine our character. It's the public times that display it. See, godly choices bring godly capital, and he had godly capital because he honored God, and he stands in contrast to Naomi, who acts rashly and with haste. But he refers to Naomi, or to Ruth as daughter, and says, the Lord bless you. And this concept of blessing is the Hebrew word hesed. And it comes up time and time again and again in the book of Ruth. And it's more than just well wishes. It's more just wanting someone to have a good experience or to be kind to them. It is loyalty towards them above and beyond what is even necessary, and saying, I'm going to fight so that you can experience good. It's helping them change their situation. So Boaz is committing to Ruth in this moment. And he says to her, as we continue in verse 11, now don't worry about anything, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone knows you are a virtuous woman. But while it is true that I am one of your family redeemers, your kinsman redeemers, there's another man who's more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. If he is willing to redeem you, then very well, let him marry you. But if he is not, then surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. Now lie down here until morning. What Boaz does is he tells Ruth, I see what's going through your mind. I see the fears and anxiety you may have. And he said, don't worry. It's going to be okay. I will make sure that you are taken care of, is the commitment that Boaz is making to Ruth. Now, the Old Testament had different laws and regulations for what happened to help different family members. And if a man died without kids, it was the responsibility of his brother to marry the widow and continue the family line. And that's kind of all it really talked about. But there's this cultural practice called a levirate marriage, in which not only was a relative to marry the widow, but was also to protect the property and give the property and possessions and all that the deceased man had to the offspring of the widow. And it would be to be the deceased man's family line that would continue. So it was a deeper and even richer understanding. But Boaz recognizes Ruth as having noble character, as being someone who is honorable and is willing to commit to Yahweh, to the Israelite God, because she left Moab. She left the paganistic lifestyle that was Moab and came to Israel to follow Yahweh. But one of the things that Boaz's commitment does is it prevents Ruth and Naomi from seeing how far they are willing to go to provide for themselves. Boaz recognizes that there is a marginalized individual here, and he says, I am going to work to help them. But he wasn't the closest family redeemer. He wasn't the one that was actually responsible to take care of Ruth and Naomi. Kind of asked ourselves, is this a complication? Is this a formality? Is Boaz really not going to be a main person in the rest of the story? Because Boaz is helpless if the actual kinsman redeemer chooses to act. But there's also some cultural concepts here, because this type of thing would have been decided by local town elders. And each town had its own rules and regulations, so from one town to the next, we might not really have known what was going to happen. But Boaz tells Ruth, I will make sure that you are redeemed. I will make sure that you are taken care of. But when I look at this story, one of the sad things about our world is that I feel we have these types of people who are marginalized, and we say, oh, the social service organizations or the government will take care of them. Instead of being the people of God to help the world, help the oppressed, help the marginalized, we rely on other organizations instead of what God has given us. Because Israel, the people of Israel, viewed God as their Redeemer, as the one who was saving them from the depths of despair. And we, as followers of Jesus, are to be avenues of God's redemption in the world. But being God's redemptive people is not something we can do from the sidelines. We need to be active participants in His kingdom and do something about it to help people in the name of Jesus. But then we look at Naomi again, who is going through all these things, having all these mindsets that she is probably struggling with of how she is going to make it in this world. And we ask, did she trust God? When she gave Ruth these instructions, was she actually trusting God, or was she trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage? But Boaz displayed godly character, and godly choices bring godly capital. And we continue with in verse 14. So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until morning, but she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other. For Boaz said, no one must know that you were here at the threshing floor. Before she left, Boaz gave her 6 scoops of barley. Then she returned to the town. She went back to Naomi, and Naomi said, just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today. So Ruth stayed with Boaz, but because of Boaz's choices that I believe God was able to give him the wisdom and poise to make, Ruth's virtue was maintained and protected. But also it protected Boaz's interest in being the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Had things gone differently, it would have compromised everything about the situation. Now, I pause again because one of the underlying assumptions that we have is we only want the virtuous to succeed. And I put it that way is, if we believe that, if that's what we believe happens, and God will only work through those who are perfectly righteous, then we have the prosperity gospel. Now, I'm not saying we need to live frivolously and recklessly against God, but I'm saying that God can find a way to shine through our human imperfections. See, God is able to provide a way for His plan of redemption, His purpose to come to fruition, even if humans find ways to wreck it. So think about that for a minute. No matter what you try to do, no matter how you fail, Jesus can still make His good come into the world. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we are given the freedom just to live however we want. We can do that if we want, but it doesn't honor God. And only through honoring God will His actual plans come to fruition, because Ruth and Naomi acted recklessly, but God used Boaz to bring the situation back to a way that honors Him. And God does that time and again. He brings the situation back to how it can honor Him again, and His plan can come forward. Now, Ruth left in secret. Didn't want other people to see what was happening. This is understandable because people talk. They were in the town of Bethlehem, a small rural community where gossip spreads quickly. But we have to make sure we don't use this story to justify our actions. Oh, well, Ruth did things in secrecy, so we don't have to be transparent. We can do things in secret as well. Make sure we don't apply those types of principles to our lives, because we need to live godly lives, and godly choices bring godly capital. Boaz was generous. And it was because of his generosity, because of his love, because of his dedication to God, was this story able to come to an ending that it's leading to. Without God's work in and through Boaz, the situation would have been starkly different. So he commits to taking care of Ruth and Naomi, and he gives her 6 scoops. Scholars don't know how much that was. It was a substantial amount, but she'd already gotten a good amount earlier from gleaning, so he was giving her more. Again, it was a way that Boaz was saying, I see how dire your situation is, and I'm going to do all I can to make sure your fears are calmed. He says, I'm going to take care of you and the needs that you have. He understood what they were going through, and he assured them. But again, make sure we don't glorify Boaz, because it was God's work in and through Boaz that allowed the situation to honor God. But one of the things Boaz did is he never ran ahead of God. He started with being generous, finding a marginalized individual that was Ruth and helping her and being generous. And then we see a situation presents itself, but instead of taking advantage of it, he says, let's make sure we honor God with whatever we're going to do. He didn't run ahead. He didn't try to manipulate the situation. He understood that God's plan is to be interpreted through God's character. And God is righteous. He is holy. He is perfect. He is good. And so we recognize the plan that God has for us is to be interpreted through who He is, which is the importance of why we have godly capital. Godly choices bring godly capital. Now, as you can imagine, Ruth and Naomi were surprised again by what was happening. Had this concept of Hesed. Naomi talks about the Hesed that they will experience, but they experience Hesed because of Boaz's Hesed towards them. This extreme loyalty that was given to them, not just a well wishes. It was, I am committing to you in the goodness in your life. But there is no Hesed without God. Because Hesed stems from who God is. It's part of His character, His goodness that He displays towards us, His commitment, His loyalty towards us. Regardless of the choices we make, God desires Hesed in our life. But only when we come around and interpret our life through who God is can we experience this Hesed. We all face trials. We all face obstacles. We all have situations that seem desperate at one point or another. And we have to get past this false thinking. There's some people that believe that God is just as likely to bless me as He is to curse me. God does not want to curse us. He does not want bad things to happen to us. He wants good in our lives. Now, sometimes He calls us to display crazy, radical faith that seems completely just strange. There are other times that He calls us to wait and be patient. He calls us to just trust Him, to not manipulate the plan for our own good, but to allow Jesus to speak into our lives. Boaz used his godly capital from the choices he made to help the situation honor God. Godly choices bring godly capital. And when we do that, we can experience His Hesed.